together to the United Nations. And I'm just here to tell you how fortunate and blessed you are to be at this panel, which is run and organized by my good friend Yvonne O'Neill, who I know from the United Nations context. I know Yvonne's work, and I know she does a fantastic job. I have no doubt that all of our panelists will be extremely exciting to listen to as well. So my role is simply to welcome you and thank you for being here, and thank you for being open to the way the Spirit will move you as being part of this workshop. And over to you, Yvonne.
And thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. We're going to start with a prayer by the Reverend Jerry Reed.
May God be with you.
And also with you.
Good and gracious God, who has many names and manifestations, we thank you for all the characteristics that you are. We thank you for this time together at this festival, and specifically for this time here in this sacred place. We thank you that you are a mothering God who mothers us into wholeness and into completeness. We thank you that you are a God who guides us in right ways and right relationships. And may we heal from all the things that have caused us harm, and may we go from this place empowered to heal, to transform, and to lift up one another as we do the work of justice for our earth, our people, and for all matters of peace. In the name and nature of Jesus the Christ, we pray.
Amen.
Thank you, Jerry, for that prayer. And I'm so happy to be joined today by Jerry, of course, Reverend Maynard, and my dear friend Marta Benavides, who is from El Salvador. She has amazing eco information to share with us. She is a mujerista, she's an eco-womanist, and it's wonderful to hear from her. And then at the far end, my dear friend Christina Denaju, who happens to be a parishioner at my parish. And when I was putting this together, when I was asked to do this, I had to think of, okay, who do I want to be with me? And I immediately thought of Marta, and I immediately thought of Christina. And Jerry got to us by the power of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
So one of the things that I wanted to do, besides those of us here on the panel, was to be able to have voice. I was going to do a video, because one of the things that I learned during COVID is to be a video editor. And so one of the things I wanted to do, and I invited many women from around the world to share a video, and then I would compile that into one video to have their voices so you can hear the activism that they're doing throughout the Anglican Communion, but it did not happen. I only got one video. So I am going to start with that particular video, and it's a video by my cousin Tiffany, who is going to share her eco-memory of her eco-feminist grandmother.
Orchid, Ixora, oleander, lady of the night, gardenia rose, and hibiscus. My maternal grandmother nurtured these flowers and many more in her garden on a tiny island called Virgin Gorda in the British Virgin Islands. Ida Flax was her name, and she was a devoted steward of God's creation. Her garden was so lovingly nurtured that it was named Best Garden at flower and agricultural shows year after year. In her yard, there were tamarind, soursop, mango, and lime trees, among others. She worked with the plants as medicine. They helped her take care of her children. She used what was local, what was growing in her yard. She and her husband lived off the land. They tended to animals. They grew crops. Nothing was wasted. Creation for her was not something to be dominated or just used carelessly for these needs. Rather, she lived in connection to it as her way of life. She lived in close, right relationship to the earth. She relied and depended on it in a reciprocal relationship. The land helped her. It provided food for her family, and she used plant fibers to make clothing and decorative items. Bees from my grandfather's hives would pollinate her flowers and produce their sought-after multi-flower honey. The garden provided bouquets of flowers for special occasions, as well as everyday beauty that brought joy to so many. She, in turn, tended the land, contributed to its flourishing, valued it as sacred, respected it deeply, treated it with great reverence. She couldn't protect all nature from harm, but she practiced ecofeminism by tending, growing, protecting, and stewarding the patch of land that was hers, treating it with faithful care. And she tended to her beautiful garden, knowing that it would outlast her, a gift for future generations. This care for the earth was an extension of her faith. My grandmother loved the Lord. Her deep and abiding, unwavering faith was the central reality of her life. She prayed a lot throughout all seasons, and her faith overflowed to others. She would always say, as long as there's life, there's hope. And God may take 7 years to answer your prayer, but He will. I believe that her faith was strengthened and fueled because she was a steady and intimate witness to the gospel as written in nature, and she constantly tended to symbols of resurrection in the natural world, God's creation. When I care for my plants or prepare an herbal remedy, it's an act of remembering. I remember my grandmother's reverence for the earth. I remember her faith. I'm blessed to come from a lineage of women whose caring for the earth and love of nature is a central aspect of their daily lives. In her poem Roots, Lucille Clifton says, "We will become a field of flowers." My grandmother knew this. She cared for the land as if she knew she was a part of it and would return to it one day. And this might be part of the reason why she wasn't afraid to die. She left her body at 100 years old, and flowers from her garden were thrown on her casket before the dirt. She ended her life in the embrace of the flowers she loved so much, in the embrace of the God she loved so much. Her legacy speaks an urgent call to each one of us to love God's creation if we claim to be lovers of God. Amen.
That was amazing. Tiffany really got it, and really, if we were like Tiffany's grandmother, Eda Flax, imagine what this world would be like. Now, you've heard a lot about creation here and a lot about climate change throughout the time that we've been here in Baltimore. So one of the things we hope that you will turn your passions into action and go from advocacy to action. Now, I think that was a great video, and my genius lies actually, not in what I'm going to be saying, but my talents lie in picking the right people for the occasion. And I know that this panel, I have the right people here. But I just want to say a few things. Climate disasters daily. Welcome to the new normal. That was a headline in yesterday's New York Times. And it continued. Around the United States, dangerous floods, heat, and storms are happening more frequently. Last week was the hottest global temperature ever recorded. And actually, in January, the New York Times reported that the last 8 years were the hottest on record. If we continue like this, my friends, life will become unsustainable on this planet. But what has gotten us into this mess where this summer we will have severe weather conditions, intense thunderstorms, critical wildflowers, and relentless heat waves. And hopefully we won't have terrible hurricanes in the Caribbean. I am a survivor of Hurricane Irma in 2017. And I can tell you that I suffer from eco-grief, I suffer from PTSD, I really suffer deeply from what I witnessed as in that terrible storm. So who has gotten us into this mess? Well, in his book, Climate Change is Racist, and it was written by a white man, a white Englishman, Jeremy Williams. His message is essentially that white people caused this mess, and white people need to take the lion's share of fixing it. He gives overwhelming evidence to support the view, and in some ways, much more importantly, he demonstrates how many, if not most, of the former colonies are suffering the effects of white industrial revolution system right at this present time. So when you read Jeremy's book, it's hard to come away from his arguments and not believe that Britain, Europe, and the United States of America are wholly responsible for the mess we're in now. Tiffany talked about, it almost seemed like her grandmother had the Garden of Eden. And if we remember the creation story in Genesis 2, God told us to take care of the Garden of Eden. In the first creation story in Genesis 1, when God created the earth and he created humankind in his own image, God told us that we would have dominion over the earth and that we should take care of it. And he gave us seeds and plants for Eden, and I wanted to make sure that we had a plant. So I went all the way over to the convention center and took this off the stage so that we could have some plants and that there could be some life and oxygen flowing from this plant for us today. Well, amplifying Jeremy's argument, well, let me just say that, I gotta again say that God entrusted us to be stewards of the earth. But it's a mess. So what's caused this mess? Well, amplifying Jeremy Williams' argument, I believe that greed, patriarchy, colonialism, white supremacy, and our love of fossil fuels have brought on the climate change. Pope Francis has said that combating climate change requires recognizing one's responsibility to those who have contributed least to its occurrence, the world's poorest and most vulnerable, and developing a sense of reasonable cooperation among everyone. Our world is now thoroughly independent and cannot allow itself to be divided into blocks of countries that promote their own interests in an isolated or unsustainable way, the Pope said. He continued, the real enemy is an irresponsible behavior that has profound consequences for every aspect of the lives of men and women. Those who are most affected by the climate crisis, women and girls in climate vulnerable regions like Africa, should be at the forefront of climate adaptation action. Climate change poses significant challenges to girls for their education. It also impacts women's health and places additional burdens on women. I feel that it's always important to have everyone's voice at the table. And as somebody who's at the United Nations, and Lena knows sometimes it's hard for us to be at the table because we represent civil society, and the United States is made up, not the United States, the United Nations is made up of member states. And there are some member states that do not want our voices at the table. But it's important to have all voices at the table. And I remember that story in Numbers 27, when Moses was dividing up the land among the men. Well, there were the daughters of Zelophehad, who had died and left 5 daughters and no sons. Now, according to the law, those daughters would get no land. But what did they do? They were in the room, they came into the room, and they had their voices heard and said, why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he has no sons? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers. So what did Moses do? Well, Moses was like, oh my gosh. So he went to the Lord, and he asked the Lord what he should do. And the Lord said to him, the daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers and pass the inheritance of their fathers on to them. If it had not been for these 5 courageous women, in the Jewish tradition, there would be no passing of land to daughters, to women. Now, there is much evidence that women and girls are adversely affected by climate change. The 66th session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women last year addressed violence against women and girls in the context of the climate crisis and environmental degradation. UN Women acknowledge that, quote, violence against women and girls and climate change are 2 of the most pressing global emergencies and sustainable development challenges of our times. With what I know from my involvement at the UN, it is evidence that policymakers must consider the challenges of climate change and gender violence. The interlinkages between climate change and gender-based violence are confirmed, including increased sexual violence, human trafficking, and child marriage. But let's take a look closer to home here in the United States. The legacy of slavery has contributed to systemic racism seen in this country. And my friend Joe yesterday talked a lot about that. This past March, during the water conference at the United Nations, I was invited to a conference called Strong Through Water. It was hosted by the United States government to showcase domestic and international action on water security. And one of the things that Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield discussed was the sewage problem for children in Lowndes County in Alabama. I first heard about this problem on 60 Minutes in December of 2021, and where I learned that the infrastructure was lacking, and Black people before then were arrested and criminally prosecuted for not having functioning septic systems, even while being denied basic services and the infrastructure needed to install a functioning system. According to Brian Stevenson, quote, "It's a familiar dynamic Black people have endured since being forcibly trafficked to this continent from Africa. Policymakers create structural inequality and then criminalize those most burdened and at risk who fail to meet the demands of that structure." And do you remember Flint, Michigan? The infrastructure failed the Black residents, and children were drinking contaminated water with lead. And in Lowndes County and in Flint, a public health crisis has emerged. Hookworms, which had been eradicated, came back. These children were found to have hookworms. Race shapes most of America. Just take our highways. When urban planner Robert Moses built projects in New York during the 1920s, he bulldozed Black and Latino homes to make way for parks and built highways through the middle of minority neighborhoods. And it says that Moses even made sure that bridges and parkways connecting New York City to beaches in Long Island were low enough to keep city buses, which would likely be carrying poor minorities, from passing underneath. But here's what happened one day. A group of white school children were going in a bus, and they had a terrible accident because he wanted to keep Blacks out, and he ended up hurting white children. But Moses was no outlier. The highways and public spaces that shape our cities were often intentionally built at the expense of Black, Latino, and other minority Americans. Now, in the interest of time, I could go on, but I'm going to pass it on because I want you to hear the voices of my friends. So I'm going to pass this on to Marta. Buenas tardes. Louder? Okay. Yes. I was late because, I have been observing, walking around, watching all people that I can, and talking with as many people that are having their materials there. And one of them had asked me to write a prayer, and I told her, the problem is that I don't pray the ways, the people pray, because to me, I talk with God as I talk with my mom and dad, and as I talk with Monsignor Romero, person to person. And I was demanded from my parents, from the time I was little, to talk with them looking at their eyes. But in the colonial times, when the Spaniards came, and I don't have anything against the Spaniards, but it's history, okay? I love Spain because, it's all about love, right? So it means that we got to extend our understanding, and understanding means what you're standing over.
You know, that's the foundation, what really lets you take steps ahead. So the Spaniards made us slaves, all of us. I come from that tradition. I look white, but in reality, all of my people in what is now called El Salvador, and notice that I say now called El Salvador. The savior it means. You know, all of us were indigenous peoples, and we were living very healthy. Can you imagine that the name of El Salvador at that time, our ancestral name was Cuscatan. It's a Lenca language. And we mix it in Spanish, and the Spanish get upset when they don't understand us because we bring our own stuff in it, right? And so, but that, can you imagine this? Now El Salvador is one of the poorest, most impoverished, I don't like to say poorest, but that's how they call it, in the continent. And what this Cuscatan meant? Land of riches. It had to be that we were very dumb, stupid, or whatever to call something that is so impoverished, land of riches. So it's against, for the longest time when I was a little girl, it was against the law to say Cuscatlan. That's how it translates into Spanish, Cuscatlan. That was a political thing. We were communists because we were naming ourselves as how we were. And rescuing our language was the same thing. But a lot of what we were learning came from our background, our ancestral background. So for example, I never went to the hospital, and I knew the difference between medicine and health. And we were educated to be healthy, so that we needed to eat properly. And it was taught to us, that we needed a lot of vegetables and fruits. And when we were little, we took our sunbath, early in the morning, because that was it is vitamin D. But then when you get to go to the regular kind of medicine, which they call it, that's the conventional medicine, they deny all this. But I grew up knowing what to put in the beans for, more nutrition. We have a plant in our country and in Mexico and in many nations that would have taken care of COVID because it cleans your lungs. But why do we need to clean our lungs now? Because we can, we have done everything to nature that now everything is polluted. Water is polluted. I don't want to even get that bottle because I don't know where that water came from, really. And so a lot of things that we have been taught through time is wrong. And so, when I came to the United States at the beginning, I came because I was in exile. And the reason was that some of us young people volunteered to teach to read and write. There was at the United Nations, I'm connecting what the sisters have said about, what happens at the United Nations. There were countries that brought that position to the United Nations that all countries had to prioritize to teach, read, and write to the people. Because for 500 years, a lot of nations that are so-called, developing or undeveloped, is because that has been denied to us. And schools are not good, and all, and imagine who got together to bring that to the United Nations, and it was approved. And at that time, most of the African countries were not independent. Not that independence is really so good, because you're independent and look at what happens in this country. So, independent means that you are dependent from within, not dependent. You see, I'm working with the vocabulary also, because that frees us. It says in the Bible, truth is going to make us free. So we got to really dig all of the time. And we even have a way at home, when we are working together, we say, amplify, deepen, and transcend. And what does that mean? That we have to see farther than what we have been taught. So when I came here, I came to study medicine. because, I was in exile and I was able to come here because they kicked us out of our country. I was 17. And, I wanted to be a doctor because there are so many illnesses in Africa, Asia. We thought that here you didn't have that. And, and then I saw the people in my country lying outside the hospitals, not being able to have the care that they needed. But then when I started to be in the United States, I volunteered in the hospitals to see if I really wanted to have that. And it's a woman way of thinking. You got to touch it, you got to think it through. My mom always used the word discern, see farther than where your nose is at. And then when you think from here, but think from here, and then your heart and your mind has to be together so your hand is going to do what you need to do. That's how we were taught, and that's the indigenous ways, you see. And so I was working in these hospitals and I thought, giving all these pills and all these people so sick, I cannot help them. And I thought, I don't want to study medicine. I want to study health. And that's why I went to the United Nations to create policies. So the people that create all those programs to take into account the ones that were not even independent yet at least in paper, it was Cuba and Mexico and some of the African countries. The ones that are seen as being this or the other, they did that. So that's why I became the first time in exile, because I was teaching to read and write. And the government committed to that, and they trained us for 2 weeks to teach to read and write. And we were teenagers. And when we went to the countryside, the women were not going to be participating because they had to take care of the family and there was no place to meet. So we met on stones at night. Having those meetings at night and getting people to think, because we couldn't get them to read and write because there was not even a piece of chalk, We had to get them to think. And so that's why a lot of times they say that Latin Americans are very critical, because we learn to see through and see what was it that we really had to do. So we started to teach each other how to take care of family, community, have parties, discerning like sayings. There is a lot of very much wisdom in the sayings. For example, let your food be your medicine, let your medicine be your food. And discussing there, and even pretending to have theater doing that. So it is important, when we make this connection, that the name of this workshop is to think through. And I made for sure to learn what you were doing here, and I admire what, as a denomination, you're doing. I have worked with your denomination before, because I have been part of the World Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches in the committees for Latin America and church and society and migrant farm workers and all those things. But the thing is that if we do all the work to take care of all the weaknesses that are in society, and we don't transform the root causes of what makes us do the aid, we forever be doing aid. And people don't need help. People need to be included, respected. And one of the things with indigenous peoples is we need to be informed properly, on time, carefully. Is information for transformation, information for education that transforms, that creates the difference. We don't want to talk about a better world. We need a different world. And this is what you're talking about. And the transformation that comes from love is that, So I went to the meetings where the people in your office, in your denomination that are working in Washington on policy. And some of you were asking questions like, can you tell us what's happening at the state level? And that is very key. But they are working at the federal level and they don't have enough support to do that transformational work. And they are not necessarily having the possibility to impact on communications. Is very important. People tell me, I don't want to do anything like Twitter. I tweet every day. And that gave me a problem because I told my president, you're doing wrong when you are doing this. And then I tweet to the Pope has said for many, many months now, Laudato Si. Do you know what Laudato Si means? Anybody? Praise the Lord. But it's not praise the Lord, praise the creation. Laudato Si. And it's a whole thing that the Pope has developed for that, and people all over the world are having that. Some in French, some in Portuguese, some in German, and I've been checking that in Spanish, and I tweet in there too. And so I tell the Pope, good, this is good. And somebody told me, yeah, but the Pope, he's not a feminist. He doesn't support women. And I said, is he supporting a different world? Yeah, then let's work with him and push him there. And I said, I am going to tweet to him. I'm going to say, my friend says that you don't support women, that this is very good how you're doing for creation, but how about moving that too in terms of women? We are not just the other side, we are part of the creation. So, all I'm saying is that we are power and we have to see how to exercise power. That's another word that I want to work with you today. This business of, they told us, especially for women, we are going to empower you. They told us, especially in Latin America, especially the impoverished people. The women have to be impoverished. And they are not talking about the machismo, the sexismo, and all everything that's going on, right? So we have to say to the women, no, that we are power, we give birth. Even if we are dying of hunger, we do. And when the guys in their sexismo and machismo hurt you, we try to transform the society. And we are fighting very hard in all these things. One of the problems that we have is that we always relate to creation. My mom told me from the beginning, I went to church, I was the only one in the family that was not with the Catholic tradition, because some Protestant people went and invited me to go to Protestant church, and I said, that's good, and my parents let me. And so I came back and my mom said, what did you learn today? And I said, well, Mama, you have to change your name. And she said, why? Her name is Eve. Do you see what Eve did to, Adam? And he ate the apple. And tried to explain that when I was about 7. My mom told me, that's a lie. That's not true. We don't even have apples here. We have bananas, she told me. And then when I told her, yes, but because of that, we were kicked out of paradise. Who told you that? Paradise is where you are. Don't you see the beauty of this nation, the rivers, the plants, the flowers, the mangoes? Who told you that this is not paradise? Don't let paradise be kicked out of you. So what I am trying to tell you is, we got to look at this frame, this instrument that you have. I don't pray, for example, San Francis of Assisi that says, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. I can't, because I don't want to talk with God as being the Lord, because that's what that's what the colonizers were to us. So, I say, hey God, I talk to person, and I say, God really knows, but I just have to say it, because I want to know that I said it. And so, I say like this, God, I'm here to do all that we can to have heaven on earth. And that's saying the Lord's Prayer at the same time, what we call the Lord's Prayer. And so we got to be willing to be the difference. And the whole world needs the difference, because at this moment, this workshop is about what love is about, which is to have all of us live in this planet that is not our planet. The environment is not our environment. The ocean is not ours. We belong to all that. To have that clarity. And so I see that we are here having an instrument such as this denomination that has all the power in your hands. And we as women should be able to point like my mom used to point these things to all of us and to my father. She in front of us would say, why are you using that word? You see? And so at this point, it is important that you accompany this denomination. we need you because at this point is like 8 billion people on this planet. And out of that is 2/3 of the 8 billion that live in poverty and in extreme poverty. And out of that, the majority are women and children and youth and peasants and indigenous peoples. You have a lot of power. Exercise it. Exercise it and know how each penny that you have is used to be the difference. And so accompany the people that are also in Washington. That means that you have to be very much up to date, like she was explaining, And I just want to give thanks for the chance that I had to be with you. Thank you. And there is one thing that has to be resolved here. And in many places where I go, people start by honoring the name of the people, the nation that used to be here before it was taken over. And we have to do that. Just like we have to call our country, our name, Cuscatan. So I hope that we can continue to do that work. I will be checking on you, believe me, because when I am friend, that's what I do. And I keep working with whoever I can. Gracias.
You done? I'm actually going to give the mic to Christina because she is going to give us a perspective from the Eastern Hemisphere. The three of us are from the Western Hemisphere, and so we want to have a slightly different perspective, and then I will go last and give you some more of an indigenous perspective that you hinted on, and I'll go into more detail about.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Martha. That was amazing. Not shocking because I knew it was going to be amazing. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Danuja. I'm, as Yvonne mentioned, a parishioner from the Episcopal Church of Holy Trinity in New York City. I'm also a member of the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Task Force of the Episcopal Diocese of New York. I'm also here as a representative of the Asia America Ministries. I see Father Isu and Koyoko here. Thank you so much for joining us. It gives me great pleasure to be here today with my panelists, Yvonne, Martha, and Jerry. I'm extremely honored and thankful that they believe in my voice and that of the Dalit women whom I represent today. So for today's session, I will be presenting on how caste as a system, a practice, and an ideology interacts with climate change and gender. I'm sure many of you already know about the South Asian caste system, but for those who don't, I will start with a brief refresher. The pyramid you see here, which we call as the caste pyramid, is a simpler and more or less a widely accepted way of representing a roughly 3,000-year-old hierarchy that is far more complex on the ground. Generally speaking, the caste system is made of 4 castes, namely the Brahmins or the priestly caste, the Kshatriyas or the warrior caste, the second rung, the third rung, which is made of the Vaishyas or the trader caste, and the fourth rung is made of the Shudras or the servant caste. Now, outside of the caste system are the untouchables, who are now widely known as the Dalits, and the indigenous / forest dweller communities of India. The key thing to note here is the line of untouchability, which decides who is with caste and who is without caste. In other words, who is of caste and who is an outcast. In fact, the English word pariah, which the Western world so freely uses to denote anyone who has been ostracized, is taken from the name of my caste, the Parayars, who are the untouchables of the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu. When the Britishers colonized us, that is how they got the word, the term. Now, the line of untouchability has been drawn based on the notion of purity and pollution, which designates the Dalits to be engaged in ritually impure occupations such as manual scavenging, the disposing of human remains and animal carcasses, and latrine cleaning. Without going into much detail, please see the right side of the pyramid, which highlights how, following the British rule, castes in India were streamlined as upper castes, backward castes, and scheduled castes/scheduled tribes. But let me be very clear. The caste system had already existed for centuries before colonization. With this in mind, let's move on to how the climate conversation intersects with the caste question. Although caste exists across South Asia, namely Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and any other country where there is a significant population of South Asians, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and some parts of Southeast Asia, I'm taking India as an example on this slide. But let us first look at India's climate reality. Mind you, this is merely a glimpse into the situation. In general, we know that climate change poses a greater challenge to developing countries in the global south. India specifically has been witnessing an increase in the frequency, severity, and alterations of weather conditions. In addition to being the third largest national emitter of CO2, carbon dioxide, in 2020, it witnessed a temperature rise of 0.7 degrees Celsius between 1901 and 2018. The month of April of last year, 2022, was the hottest month in India in over 122 years, with cumulative deaths due to heat waves standing at 24,000 since 1992. On the other hand is India's social reality. India is home to the largest number of impoverished people in the world. Caste-based social exclusion, as seen in the previous slide, is still rigorously enforced, making women from the Dalit and Adivasi. When I use the word Adivasi, it literally means people who have lived before, in other words, indigenous communities, the marginalized groups in the community, facing extreme poverty, multi-layered discrimination, and sexual violence. India is ranked at the bottom of the Global Hunger Index, and 6% of its population lack access to safe water, while 54% lack access to household sanitation facilities. We'll come back to the access of water when I talk about caste. Now, Dalits, indigenous communities, and some of the most backward castes, particularly their women and gender minorities, sit at the intersection of this climate reality and social reality. And because of their, sit at this intersection because of their dependence on natural resources for their livelihoods. Now, because their dependence on natural resources for their livelihoods is so high, they have very fewer resources to counter damages owing to climate change. Neither can they secure alternative livelihoods. Even if the men do, say, migrate to cities for jobs in construction, in building, in restaurants, other kinds of disorganized labor, unorganized labor, the women cannot because they have to take care of their family. They often have to shoulder higher physical burdens in the event of a drought or a famine, meaning they have to travel longer distances for water and firewood. Sometimes they are forced into sex work. For example, and I'm quoting from an article here, the number of women who moved to Kolkata's red light district, increased by 20% to 25% in the aftermath of a cyclone known as Aila. I'm sure many of us even haven't heard of these cyclones because it doesn't get covered as much as the cyclones in other countries do. Many of these sex workers identified themselves as bhasha or environmental refugees. Women struggle to get even basic necessities such as sanitary napkins and baby food in the aftermath of natural disasters. In worst cases, children are abandoned, who are mostly girls. Now, it is within this context that we need to understand what is Dalit environmentalism. It is essentially a set of conversations that runs counter to the dominant narrative of South Asian environmentalism, which, because it is upper caste led, it is devoid of anti-caste perspectives. Like environmental racism, it ignores how other systems of social hierarchy aggravates the problems of climate change and how solutions put forward by the majority, in this case the upper castes, and we call them the white equivalents of India, are not in line with the needs and vulnerabilities of the minority. For example, a village in India is typically structured by caste. The center of a village is occupied by the Brahmins or the priestly class, which is where the temple, the best of the produce, the power, all of it resides, while the periphery of that village is occupied by the Dalits or the untouchables, same, one and the same, where the sewage of the village literally drains into. The dominant narrative of Indian environmentalism, or upper caste environmentalism, or environmental casteism, as one of the scholars puts it, is largely focused on the protection of villages, rural and traditional livelihoods, which are all caste-based. Now, Dalits or untouchables, we want to get away from that. And so urban and city spaces symbolize a certain type of freedom that villages don't. Now, Dalit environmentalism also recognizes the long history of the Dalit community's fight for environmental justice. The picture you see here onto the left was done by one of our young Dalit artists who's depicting the Mahad Satyagraha, or the Mahad struggle. Mahad is the name of the place, of 1927, which was led by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, our most revered icon, to allow the then untouchables to use the water of a public tank at a time when even animals were allowed to drink from the tank, but not the untouchables. Dalit environmentalism also studies the specific ways in which caste marginalized are affected by increasing conflicts over resource rights, livelihood rights, extraction of raw materials, alteration of ecosystems, resource prices, and environmental degradation in the cities. And finally, it is reflected in our works, words, innovation, and movements, which is helping redefine the very concept of development, modernity, community, and livelihood in South Asia. I want to end my presentation by asking for 3 things from you and anyone you will be speaking to. One is advocacy. Choose to actively intervene, especially in calling in caste blindness in climate conversations. 2, influence. If you are in a position of power or authority, consider what you can do to influence a change in policies and practices. And lastly, be in solidarity. Amplify Dalit and caste marginalized voices. I appreciate that this is a relatively new conversation, but that is part of the violence. We have been deliberately silenced. So I ask that you seek to understand caste history, anti-caste resistance, and nuances within South Asian discourses, specifically in climate conversations, and have us be part of your beloved community, even as we speak our truth to power. Thank you.
Piali Mayoko Yani Mitsmo Piali. Hello, may grandfather bless you. My name is Jerry. I'm going to give you a perspective on this conversation, this intersectional conversation on race, gender, and climate from an indigenous two-spirit perspective. When we talk about matters of climate, and we have to talk about relationship, which is a fundamental part of indigenous consciousness. And our understandings, whether this is indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere or the Eastern Hemisphere, this is common throughout the globe amongst indigenous people. When we think about life, we think of not ourselves, we think about our community. And that community includes people from other generations. We often make our plans by thinking about the 7 generations to come and the 7 generations of the past. So we see ourselves in a huge lineage. And so when we have these conversations, we have to actually subvert this tendency, as you illustrated in your slide with the pyramid, of thinking of all the powers at the top, and we need to hold it all up at the bottom. Whereas we think more in a circle, where everyone is perfectly equal, And also everyone is perfectly wanted and needed. And we also, in our understanding of consciousness, do not reduce our human existence to one portion of our experience, whether it is our gender or the level of income that we have or where we were born, but rather we actively integrate all of who we are. As you mentioned about, we use our mind, we use our hands, we use our hearts when we are making discernments and living and engaging with life. We use all of who we are, and that includes our community, because we do not see ourselves as separate from that. I am a two-spirit person. Two-spirit is a term that was developed in 1990 at an international indigenous conference as a placeholder term to help unify this understanding that all of our tribes had of gender expansive people. None of our tribes had only two genders. That was a made-up colonizer concept. So the gender binary is 100% faked, and you all were deluded into thinking it was real. So welcome to being woken up. Most of our tribes had at least 5. Some people had 7, others had numerous amounts. And so two-spirit was a term that was developed to act as an umbrella term, and then under that term, all of our different tribes have different words for the concept of a two-spirit person, which is typically a third gender person who we believe to be the embodiment of both masculine energies, feminine energies, and also the divine and the mundane, all at the same time. And we had ceremonial roles that were taught to us that were intended to teach us how to live as a whole being, including all of our parts, all of who we are, and all of who we are coming to be. So our work as two-spirit people was supposed to be the ones who brought wholeness to the community. That's why it's actually interesting when we talk about matters of LGBT issues in our current day. I often bring up that it used to be, queerphobia is not traditional, because it used to be a badge of honor to have a two-spirit person in your family, because they were seen as the completion of the family. And we oftentimes were medicine people, we were healers, we married people, brought people together. We also led people into battle and things like that. So, as a two-spirit person, a large part of my work when it comes to climate is to help people realize that in our language, we like to say, we are defenders of the earth. Indigenous people don't say that. We say that we are defenders of our Mother Earth, because we see ourselves as in relationship with Mother Earth, as a part of Earth. And we know that whatever we do, it impacts us as well. Now, we've had to relearn some things, because when colonization happened, many of our wisdom keepers, including two-spirit people, were killed. And because of that, we lost a lot of our ceremonial teachings, our sacred teachings, cultural things. And so part of the work of decolonizing is having these conversations of intersectionality, but also helping to reclaim some of that ancestral memory. And we do that by building a community together, and suddenly we tap into a way of thinking and a way of being that is actually our ancestors speaking up and saying, this is the way that you need to live in this world. And so I want to be sure that we leave some time for questions, so I won't continue on. But I also want to hint a little bit to the conversation that actually is consistent with all of us, in that there is an epidemic in this country that nobody talks about, and that is the reality that Indigenous girls, women, and two-spirit people every 5 minutes are kidnapped and murdered by white people, basically, in this land. And there is a campaign called MMIWG2S, and Missing, Murdered, and Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. And you know the campaign because it has a red hand. If you look at the back of my ribbon shirt, you can see a red hand there. That's what that represents. And in your churches, this is a good way to begin some of these conversations around gender, race, and climate, because it's a conversation that's not being had. And if all of our indigenous women and our girls and our Two-Spirit siblings get eradicated as a continuation of this centuries of genocide, we will lose the necessary wisdom that we need to develop the different world that you were talking about. So Google it, look it up, get connected with folks here, and have those conversations in your community, and know that when you have those conversations, you're building community, you're doing revolutionary work, and we will together make the different world that we need, which will be a better world. Amen.
So thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Malta. There's so much more that we could have said, but of course we don't have the time. So, because one of the things that I would have liked to have talked about would have been like food insecurity and eating the right foods, and the fact that we're seeing, why are we seeing so much autism in children when 50 years ago it was almost unheard of? And so there is a connection. And so one of the things, I'll have you ask questions, and one of the things I would like us to do is not have this just be a one-off conversation, but we want to start a movement, and we want to continue these conversations. And there were lots of information passed along of many things that happened in the Episcopal Church. And so we all need to band together and work together to be the beloved community that we are called to be, to work in love, because this is all about love, so that we can actually make this world a better place and be the world that God told us to take care of when God created us. Okay, so are there any questions or comments?
Stand, and when you ask, stand up so we can see you. And don't be shy. We gave you a lot of information, we know.
Christina, could you put your slide up with your contact information?
Sure, of course, yeah.
Koyoko?
Yeah, I think it's very important to carry the conversation going. So my question is there any national desk or office that will be able to oversee some of the advocacy and all the things you mentioned? Because I'm from the Diocese of New York, so it's very easy to access to 815, but if you want to make this as a movement, you have to be able to do that nationally. So my question is there any office that will help us start or develop and continue?
Well,
or
there,
the website or anything? I'm not very I'm not very good at social media, but I think we'll be able to.
well, a lot comes out of out of Creation Care, which is under the direction of Reverend Melanie Mullen. And she was actually the person who invited me to take part in this. And I told her that we want to start a movement. So we'll be working on it. And of course we have all your information. So we will get back to you on how we can continue this, because as I said, we need to have a movement. And there's a lot going on already in Creation Care, but we can all, band together and do a lot more. So I'm happy. Yes.
I just have a quick comment and one question. One of the things I'm really aware of, having moved back to the West, is I want to know what's being talked about, because I think our water wars are coming soon. Our cities are not sustainable. We've done it, like even now, this conference, for my tradition, there used to be a siesta that's all but gone, right? Because that was a using of it was too hot to work.
Yeah.
So what are we doing with that? Because it kills me that places are still giving people fines for not using all of that precious water to water their lawns, rather than watering plants, etc. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Well, can I just say that about 12 years ago, when I was very active with the Anglican United Nations office. We had a director here, a woman named Helen Wangusa from Uganda, who headed up that office. And one of the things I always remember Helen saying to me was that the next World War will be about water. And it was a very prophetic thing to say, so that's that. Jerry?
Well, I guess one point that I meant to make too is that's what's making it so much harder for our women who often walk miles and miles and miles for water. So again, that's another intersection we have to think about.
Yeah. I would also add to that conversation that a good place, sometimes getting conversations started requires provocation. And a great place to do that provocation would be your urban development office in your city. Because part of the reason why we don't have water in some places is because there are people and behind closed doors who do not want us to have water. And urban development offices are often the people who want that, and that's one of the ways that Jim Crow and a lot of environmental racism gets promoted through those offices. So that would be a good place to cause some provocation.
You know, because we don't have a lot of what you have in our countries, and also we get persecuted for demanding water and for taking care of the rivers and for, you know, trying to live the kind of life that we should. What we do is when we have a meeting like this, we say, are there any of us that would like to form a steering little committee to keep going? And that's how we get going. And right now, we have many committees going on in spite of the depression.
And as you know, we cannot live without water. Water is a human right. Yeah. And so we have to fight for that right. Because I grew up on a small island, the island that Tiffany was talking about, and I never had to buy water. And we have to buy water nowadays. So the water was always free. We got the water from the rain, and we also got the water from wells. And I don't see the people on that island anymore catching the rainwater or digging wells. They actually the main well, which was a very small island, and so the well, we call it the pump well because they had a pump, you know, to pump water for the cattle and so on. But it was a meeting place for people, and so community, and that sense of community doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I live on a block, and I walk down the block, and one of the things I noticed, and I live in a really fairly affluent neighborhood, people on their lawns, instead of having grass, they have concrete because they don't want to have to upkeep the lawn and water the lawn. But, so if we have so much concrete around us, when it rains, what happens? Where's that water going to go? Yeah. So these are things that, you know, we need to think about. And I want to get more active in community-based organizations in my neighborhood because I think it's very important, and I would also urge you to do something like that, be active in the community.
There is one thing that I wanted to leave for end. Ocean. There is only one ocean, except that in some places it has other names because of the geography, and sometimes we call it El Mar, the sea, right? But that's the majority of the planet. And right now we are talking about the emergency with ocean. That is polluted, that is plastic, and that there is a campaign 30 by 30, that by 2030, 30% of the ocean is going to be clean. I just want to share one thing with you. In my country, they are pushing the fisher people out of the coast because they want it for tourism. And I know that that's happening in many places like Puerto Rico and even the Dominican Republic and like that. But also, you know, they want to, the guy in my country wants to create a little island into the next Cancun, you know. And what are our priorities? But this is the thing. There is deforestation going on in the planet. Terrible deforestation. My country is the second deforested country in Latin America and the Caribbean. Haiti, the first one. So whenever I do my work for my country, I always am working for Haiti also. But you see, the way that is happening is that this is the beauty. It's all about love. And the best way to understand it is, we have deforested, and it's major companies that are behind that. It's not most the people, you know? The people have to do it in order to survive, and we have to understand that. And really get to the root of the problems. What's systemic? What is structural that we got to work also to find the solutions? So the thing is that because the trees cannot catch the CO2, as the sister was saying, you know, the oceans are doing it. And how is the oceans doing it? Through the coral reefs. And how is it that happened there? Because there is the plankton in there. But because it continues to be contaminated, polluted, we are killing life in the ocean. And now they are wanting to go to deep mining sea. So we have to be aware of this. But because the coral reefs are dying, even though those are protected areas officially, they are creating death there. That is, all that is dying is creating not only not catching the CO2, but it's creating methane. And that's what's going to happen. The oceans are not going to be able to catch the CO2 that is very bad for health, but then methane together, and that is coming very soon. So please pay attention to what is the policy of the area where you are and your countries, and really work on that, because otherwise we can be doing a lot of other things, but we are going to have that combination, CO2 and methane.
Thank you, Martha. In 2017, in June of 2017, the United Nations had its first ocean conference, and I had the opportunity to speak on behalf of Africa Development Interchange Network, which I represent at the United Nations. And I had actually wanted to read some of the things I said, but of course there wasn't enough time. Because as an island girl, the ocean is very important to me, the land as well as the sea, because a lot of my food came from the ocean and still comes from the ocean. I don't eat meat, but I do eat fish. But only fish that is wild caught. I do not eat farmed fish. It is not healthy for us. So I thank you all. We're out of time. I thank you for coming, and God bless.